A German officer was ordered to execute prisoners, but what he did next cost him everything. He chose humanity over orders and lost everything but his soul. Chapter 1. The Echo in the Attic. The August air in the attic of the Chicago bungalow was thick and suffocating, smelling of decaying paper, cedar wood, and a century of dust. Alex Miller wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, leaving a grimy streak across his temple. Every breath felt heavy. Outside, the sounds of Logan Square, the distant rumble of the L train, the faint cry of a siren, seemed to belong to another world. Here, under the eaves of his late grandmother's house, only the past existed, packed away in sagging cardboard boxes and shrouded in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. His Oma Lena had been a quiet woman, her life a meticulously ordered collection of routines and unspoken sorrows. Her stories of the old country were vague, edited for a young American grandson, always glossing over the war years with a sad, distant look. Now, sorting through the remnants of her 92 years felt like an archaeological dig into a life he only partially knew. He was about to call it a day when his foot snagged on a loose floorboard near the chimney stack. Annoyed, he kicked at it, but it shifted unnaturally. Curiosity piqued. He knelt, the old wood groaning under his weight. He worked his fingers into the gap and pried. The board came up with a reluctant screech, revealing a dark, shallow cavity beneath. Nestled inside was a small, olive-drab metal box, tarnished with age, and secured with a simple, rusted latch. It was an ammo box, he realized, but not American. The stenciled eagle and swastika, though faded, were unmistakable. A cold knot formed in his stomach. His grandmother had been a child during the war, a refugee who had fled with her mother from the ruins of Dresden. What was this? With a screwdriver from his pocket, he forced the latch. It sprang open with a metallic groan. The air that escaped smelled of old leather and something else, something faintly metallic like dried blood. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed wool, was a leather-bound journal, its cover stamped with the initials K.R. Beside it lay a small bundle of letters tied with a frayed ribbon, a black-and-white photograph of a stern-looking man in a Wehrmacht officer's uniform, and a heavy, dark medal, an Iron Cross, first class. Alex's German was rusty, learned from Saturday classes his Oma had insisted upon, but he could make out the name written on the inside cover of the journal. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, captain, his great-grandfather, the man no one ever mentioned, the father his grandmother had lost in the war. He opened the journal. The pages were filled with dense, elegant script. The ink faded from black to a brownish sepia. The first entry was dated 15 November 1944. "The snow began today," Alex murmured, translating aloud in a halting whisper. "It is not a gentle snow. It is a hard, merciless snow, driven by a wind that carries the scent of pine and gunpowder. The men are cold, not just from the wind, but from the inside. It is a coldness of the soul. We are holding a position that no longer matters, in a war that is already lost, for a cause I no longer recognize. God help us. God help me." Alex sat back on his heels, the heavy, humid air of the attic suddenly feeling frigid. The image he'd held of the war, gleaned from history books and Hollywood films, was one of clear lines, of good versus evil. This journal, this box, was something else entirely. It was a voice from the other side, a voice that belonged to his own blood. It was the beginning of a story that had been deliberately buried, and he felt an overwhelming, unshakable need to unearth it. Chapter 2. The Weight of Command. Eastern Poland, November 1944. The wind was a physical force, a relentless assault that scoured the frozen landscape and tore at the tattered grey uniforms of Captain Klaus Richter's men. It funneled through the skeletal remains of the village, whistling a mournful dirge through shelled-out cottages and skeletal trees. Every gust carried particles of ice that stung the skin like needles. Klaus pulled his collar tighter, the coarse wool doing little to fend off the bone-deep chill. From his position at the edge of the village, he watched his men work, their movements sluggish, their faces gaunt and smeared with grime. They were turning a dilapidated stone barn into a command post, reinforcing its walls with timber scavenged from other ruined buildings. They were boys, most of them, 18, 19, old enough to fight and die for a Germany they'd only known under one fanatical ideology, but too young to remember a world without it. He saw the hollow look in their eyes, the same vacant stare he saw in the mirror each morning. They weren't soldiers anymore, they were survivors, clinging to the edge of a collapsing world. Herr Hauptmann, Klaus turned. Sergeant Müller, a barrel-chested veteran from Bavaria, with a face like a roadmap of the entire Russian campaign, stood at attention. His breath plumed in the frigid air. The eastern perimeter is secured. We found nothing. The partisans, they move like ghosts in these forests. They know the land, Sergeant. We are merely unwelcome guests, Klaus replied, his voice low and gravelly. Ensure the watches are doubled tonight. No one gets comfortable, no one gets careless. Jawohl, Herr Hauptmann. Müller saluted and moved off, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened mud. Klaus's gaze drifted to the village church, its steeple miraculously intact, a lonely finger pointing to a steel-grey, unforgiving sky. He felt the weight of his command, not as a badge of honor, but as a burden. He was responsible for these men, for their lives. Yet what was he leading them toward? A glorious victory? No. He was leading them through a managed retreat, a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts, all the way back to a homeland that was being bombed into dust. The letters from his wife, Elsbeth, spoke of dwindling rations and nightly terror in Dresden. His duty was here, but his heart, his soul, was with her and their young daughter, Lena. The roar of engines shattered the brittle quiet. 2 military trucks and a Kübelwagen staff car stormed into the village square, their tires churning up frozen mud. They weren't Wehrmacht. Their lines were too clean, their paint too black, their soldiers too well-fed. SS. The sight of the twin lightning bolt insignia sent a ripple of unease through his men. Work slowed, conversations died. A man emerged from the staff car, impeccably dressed in a black SS officer's uniform, his silver death's head insignia gleaming even in the dull light. He was young, perhaps not yet 30, with cold, calculating blue eyes and a faint, condescending smirk. "Hauptmann Klaus Richter?" the officer called out, his tone sharp and imperious. He didn't wait for a reply, striding forward and extending a gloved hand in a perfunctory gesture. "Obersturmführer Schmidt, das Reich Security Main Office." Klaus gave a stiff, correct nod, ignoring the offered hand. "What is your business here, Obersturmführer? This is a Wehrmacht sector." Schmidt's smirk widened. "The lines of authority are fluid on the front, especially when it comes to matters of state security." He gestured back toward one of the canvas-covered trucks. "Last night a supply convoy was ambushed 5 kilometers from here. 2 of our men were killed, the work of Polish bandits, aided by locals." From beneath the canvas of the truck, Klaus could hear a low murmur, the sound of a crying child. His blood ran cold. Schmidt's eyes locked onto his, devoid of any warmth or humanity. "High Command has authorized a reprisal. An example must be made. We have rounded up 20 civilians from the outlying farms, men, women, children, collaborators and sympathizers." He paused, letting the words hang in the freezing air. "As the ranking army officer in this village, Hauptmann," Schmidt said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "you will have the honor of overseeing the execution, tomorrow at dawn, in the square for all to see." Chapter 3. The Coldness of Conscience. Back in the sweltering Chicago attic, Alex felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He ran a hand over his face, his fingers trembling slightly. The journal lay open on his lap, its neat, disciplined script detailing a horror that felt both distant and deeply personal. He imagined his great-grandfather, a man whose face he only knew from a single stern photograph, standing in the snow, receiving an order that was not a military command, but a moral poison. He read on, his Omer's lessons in German grammar returning to him with a grim new purpose. "An order is not a suggestion," Schmidt had said, his breath a phantom mist in the air. "It is a statement of fact. You will carry it out." Klaus stood frozen in the village square, long after the SS officer had strode away, his black uniform swallowed by the gloom of the approaching evening. The wind howled, whipping snow into stinging vortexes. Schmidt's words echoed in his mind, each syllable a hammer blow against the foundations of his identity. He was a soldier. He followed orders. It was the principle upon which his entire life had been built, from his days as a cadet in the academy to the battlefields of France and the endless frozen steppes of Russia. But this was not a military order. It was not about taking a hill or holding a line. or destroying an enemy position. It was about murdering the defenseless. It was a command to butcher mothers in front of their children, to execute old men whose only crime was living on the wrong patch of earth. This was the work of butchers, not soldiers. The Wehrmacht had a code, a tradition of honor that the black-shirted fanatics of the SS spat upon. Yet, here he was, ordered to be their instrument. His feet, numb with cold, carried him toward the church. 2 SS guards, young and arrogant, stood flanking the heavy oak doors, their machine pistols held at the ready. They eyed him with suspicion as he approached. "I am to inspect the prisoners," Klaus stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The Obersturmführer's orders," one of the guards sneered. "Making sure they don't catch a chill before morning?" He stepped aside nonetheless, the authority of Klaus's rank, even a Wehrmacht rank, enough to ensure compliance, however grudging. The air inside the church was colder than it was outside, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and damp stone. A few flickering candles cast long dancing shadows across the pews, illuminating the faces of the damned. There were about 20 of them, huddled together in small family groups for warmth and comfort. An old man with a magnificent white beard coughed, a dry, racking sound that echoed in the vaulted silence. A young mother rocked a crying baby, whispering frantic, soothing words in Polish, and then he saw her. A little girl, no older than his own Lena, maybe 6 or 7 years old. She had wide, terrified blue eyes and blonde hair peeking out from under a woolen shawl. She wasn't crying. She was just staring at him, at his uniform, at the iron cross on his breast. In her eyes he didn't see hatred. He saw a profound, soul-shattering confusion. She did not understand what was happening, only that men in uniforms like his had torn her from her home. In that moment, the image of his daughter, Lena, superimposed itself over the girl's face. He saw Lena's smile, heard her laughter, felt the memory of her small hand in his. He thought of his wife, Elsbeth, and the life they had built, a life of decency and principle, a life that was now a world away. What kind of man would she be married to if he did this? What kind of father would Lena have? He would be a monster, a hollow man, his uniform nothing more than a shroud for a dead soul. He turned abruptly and walked out of the church, the guards' mocking glances bouncing off him. He strode past the command post, past the questioning looks from his own men, and out to the edge of the village. The snow was falling harder now, the flakes thick and wet. The wind was rising to a gale, a blizzard in the making. Standing there, with the full force of the Polish winter tearing at him, Klaus Richter made his choice. He would not obey the order. Defiance was suicide, but obedience was a fate worse than death. There had to be another way. And as the world dissolved into a maelstrom of white, a desperate, impossible idea began to form in the frozen depths of his mind. The storm was not just a threat, it was an opportunity. It was their only hope. Chapter 4. A whisper in the blizzard night fell not as a gradual dimming of the light, but as a heavy black curtain dropped over the world. The blizzard had arrived in its full, unholy fury. Snow swirled so densely it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The wind screamed like a vengeful spirit, rattling window frames and threatening to tear the roofs from the few remaining intact buildings. For most, the storm was a curse. For Klaus, it was a prayer being answered. He found Sergeant Miller in the makeshift barracks, a cramped and draughty cottage where a dozen of their men were huddled around a small smoking stove. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and cheap tobacco. Klaus gestured with his head, and Müller, sensing the urgency, followed him outside into the roaring chaos of the storm. They stood in the lee of the barn, the wind tearing at their words. "The men are on edge, Herr Hauptmann," Müller shouted over the gale. "They've heard the rumors about the SS and the reprisals." The word tasted like ash in his mouth. Klaus looked his sergeant in the eye. He had to choose his next words with the care of a man disarming a mine. Müller was a good man, a soldier to the core, but this was beyond duty, this was treason. "Müller, you fought at Stalingrad," Klaus began, his voice low and intense. "You have seen the true face of this war. Tell me, is there honor in shooting children in a churchyard?" Müller's rugged face, illuminated by the faint light spilling from a nearby window, hardened. The lines around his eyes deepened. He was silent for a long moment, the wind his only reply. "There is no honor left in this war, Herr Hauptmann. There is only survival." "And what of the soul?" Klaus pressed. What is the point of surviving if we become the monsters they claim we are fighting? That was it. The question that hung between them. Müller stared at him, his gaze searching, and in the old sergeant's eyes, Klaus saw the same flicker of weariness, the same profound disgust he felt himself. "What are you asking of me, sir?" Müller asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The blizzard," Klaus said, turning his face to the blinding snow. "It is our cover. Schmidt is in his quarters, warm with brandy. His men are complacent. They think we are broken, that we will do their dirty work for them." He turned back to Müller. "I cannot give that order, Sergeant. I will not." Understanding dawned on Müller's face, followed by a wave of raw fear, and then something else. A grim, resolute acceptance. He had seen too much, lost too much to let this final atrocity stain his conscience. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "What is the plan?" They spoke quickly, their words snatched away by the wind. The plan was desperate, flawed, and hinged entirely on the storm's ferocity. Müller would select 2 other men, veterans he trusted implicitly, men who had families back home and who had grown cynical of the party fanatics. They would create a diversion, a report of a partisan patrol probing the western perimeter. It had to be convincing enough to draw the attention of the main SS contingent. While Schmidt and his men were distracted, Klaus and Müller would deal with the 2 guards at the church. They would not kill them if they could avoid it. They would disarm and bind them. Then they would lead the prisoners out the back of the church, through the graveyard, and into the woods. "There is an old hunting trail 2 kilometers north of here," Müller explained, his voice urgent. "It's treacherous in this weather, but it leads deep into the forest. The partisans have caches there. If they can make it that far—" He left the rest unsaid. "It gives them a chance," Klaus finished. "It is more than they have now." He clasped Müller's shoulder, a gesture that went far beyond the boundaries of rank. It was the pact of 2 men bound by a shared, desperate humanity. "Do not fail, Sergeant." "We will not, sir," Müller replied, his jaw set. He disappeared into the swirling snow, a ghost on an impossible mission. Klaus was alone again. The weight of the decision settled on him, immense and terrifying. He was no longer just a captain in the German army. He was a mutineer, a traitor to the Reich. He was betting his life, the lives of his men, and the lives of 20 innocent strangers on a single desperate act of defiance. He drew his pistol, the cold steel a comfort in his hand, and began to walk toward the church. The blizzard raged around him, a perfect storm to swallow a secret or to bury them all. Chapter 5. The Cost of a Soul. The 2 SS guards at the church door were huddled in the archway, trying to escape the worst of the wind's fury. They were complaining, their voices sharp with irritation, when Klaus and Müller emerged from the white curtain of the storm. They didn't stand a chance. Müller, moving with the brutal efficiency of a man who had survived countless close-quarters encounters, disabled the first guard with the butt of his rifle. Klaus had his pistol pressed to the second guard's throat before the man could even raise his weapon. "Silence!" Klaus hissed, his voice a blade in the roaring wind. "Or this blizzard will be the last thing you ever feel." The guard's eyes were wide with terror. He nodded, and they were quickly bound, gagged, and dragged into a small, dark sacristy. Inside the church, the prisoners flinched as Klaus entered, his snow-caked uniform making him look like an avenging spectre. He raised a hand, not in threat, but in a plea for quiet. He found the young mother with the baby and the little girl with the piercing blue eyes. Speaking in broken Polish, supplemented with clear, universal gestures, he conveyed his message. Forest, escape, freedom. Fear warred with a desperate, flickering hope on their faces. The old man with the white beard, seemingly their elder, stepped forward. He looked at Klaus, his gaze probing deep, searching for the truth. He must have found it, because he gave a single, solemn nod. A silent current of understanding passed through the huddled group. They would trust him. They would take this one, impossible chance. They moved like phantoms out the back of the church and into the graveyard. The blizzard was their cloak. Headstones draped in thick blankets of snow provided momentary cover as they navigated toward the tree line. The cold was savage. The baby was blessedly quiet, bundled deep in its mother's arms. The little girl held Klaus's gloved hand, her grip surprisingly strong, her small feet struggling to keep up in the deep drifts. Each step was a battle against the wind and the sucking snow. They had just reached the edge of the forest when a gunshot cracked through the howl of the storm, sharp and distinct. It was followed by shouting from the village. The diversion was over. Schmidt knew. "Go!" Klaus yelled to Müller, pushing the old man forward. "Get them to the trail, do not stop for anything." Müller didn't hesitate. He herded the terrified group into the relative shelter of the pines, disappearing into the maelstrom. Klaus stayed behind, positioning himself behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak, his pistol raised. The little girl looked back at him one last time, her face a pale oval in the darkness, before she was pulled away into the woods. Minutes later, figures emerged from the whiteout. It was Schmidt, flanked by 3 of his men, their black uniforms a stark contrast to the snow. "Richter!" Schmidt's voice was a venomous roar, barely audible over the wind. "Traitor! You disgrace the uniform! You disgrace the Reich!" Klaus didn't answer. He waited until they were closer, then fired 2 shots, aiming not to kill, but to slow them down, to drive them to cover. The acrid smell of cordite was instantly ripped away by the wind. Schmidt and his men dove behind the snow-covered tombstones, returning fire. Bullets splintered the bark of the oak tree beside Klaus's head. He was a single man against 4, buying time with seconds that felt like lifetimes. He knew he wouldn't win this fight. He wouldn't survive it. But with every shot he fired, the prisoners were getting further away. His life was the price for theirs. It was a currency he was now willing to spend. He fired his last bullet as a searing pain erupted in his shoulder, spinning him around and throwing him to the ground. His pistol flew from his numb fingers. Through a haze of pain, he saw Schmidt approaching, his Luger pistol aimed steadily at Klaus's head. The SS officer's face was contorted in a mask of triumphant fury. "You threw your life away for Polish filth," Schmidt spat, kicking Klaus's side. "For what? Some misplaced sentimental honor? You are a fool." Klaus looked up at him, the snow melting on his face, his vision blurring. He thought of Elsbeth. He thought of Lena. And he thought of the little girl with the blue eyes, now safe in the forest. "I did it for Germany," Klaus whispered, his voice raspy. "The real Germany. The one you have destroyed." Schmidt's lip curled in a final sneer. "There is no other Germany." The final entry in the journal was short, the script almost illegible, as if written by a hand shaking from cold or injury or both. "They are gone. Into the forest. I do not know if they will survive, but I have given them a chance. Schmidt has me. I am told I will be sent to Berlin for court-martial. A traitor's death awaits. Elsbeth, my love, Lena, my little light, forgive me. I chose my soul over my life. I pray that someday you will understand." There were no more entries. Alex closed the journal. The attic was dark now, the only light coming from a single bare bulb overhead. The suffocating heat of the day had finally broken, and a cool breeze drifted through the small window, carrying the scent of rain. He sat there for a long time, the weight of the small book in his hands, feeling immense, heavier than any history text he had ever read. He picked up the black-and-white photograph of Klaus Richter. He saw the stern officer, yes, but now he saw something else behind the severe expression. The burden of a man trapped in an impossible time, the resolve of a father who saw his own child's face in that of a stranger. His Oma Lena had never spoken of her father. Alex had always assumed it was because he had died a soldier for a cause she was ashamed of. Now he understood. Perhaps she never knew the full story. Or perhaps the story was simply too painful to tell. The story of a father who had performed one last heroic act of defiance, only to be swallowed by the very darkness he fought against, leaving his own daughter to grow up without him. The silence in his family was not a silence of shame. It was a silence of profound and complicated grief. Alex carefully placed the journal, the letters, and the iron cross back into the metal box. This wasn't just a collection of old relics anymore. It was a legacy. It was the story of a man who, when ordered to become a monster, chose instead to be a human being, whatever the cost. And in the quiet of his grandmother's attic, Alex Miller finally understood that the truest acts of courage are often the ones that are never known, whispered only in the pages of a forgotten journal, waiting for a future generation to find them, and finally, to understand.